Thank you very much, Tammy, and good afternoon, everybody. This is a unique way of meeting all of you. I am hoping that the Ambler Arboretum is nothing new and no place new to all of you who are joining us today. But I have a little bit of an introduction to the Arboretum just in case it's a place that you haven't been or you haven't been in a while. If we were all sitting in a room together, I'd ask you to raise your hands and let me know who's been there before. But maybe during the question and answers, I will ask that question myself. So we're going to talk a little bit also about 4 seasons of vegetable gardening and getting into the basics of starting a vegetable garden, taking care of a vegetable garden, considerations to make if you want to start your own vegetable garden, and maintaining it throughout the season. And I'm hoping to spend some time on questions and answers because I'm not sure, I don't have a good handle on what everybody's experiences are and what your green thumb level is. And so, so if you do have questions, definitely write them into the chat or hold on to them for the end, and I'm happy to answer them. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the Ambler Arboretum here. And so I don't know if you all are familiar, but there's an organization called America's Garden Capital, and that is part of Greater Philadelphia Gardens. And that's a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the 36 public gardens within 30 miles of Philadelphia. And the Ambler Arboretum is one of those gardens. And so you can see the gardens have a wide variety of niches that they fill, interests that they support, from spring interest to vegetable gardening, all kinds of things, naturalistic gardening, native plants. There's a garden for you. And for those people who don't think they're into gardens, there's a garden for them too, because they also have cafes and museums and sculpture parks and children's playgrounds and all kinds of things. So I encourage you to come and visit the Ambler Arboretum, but also all of the public gardens within the area. And if you need some more incentive, I'll let you know that there is a America's Garden Capital passport, and that lists the 36 gardens within 30 miles of Philadelphia. You can get them at any of these public gardens when we reopen. Some of the gardens are doing online virtual passport stamps if you go and visit their gardens through their social media pages. And basically, when you visit, you can get a sticker or a stamp. As you see here, there's a stamp. Some places do stickers. The Arboretum has a secret code because we don't have a visitor center for people to visit and get their passports stamped. But you can fill out all of those. You might have seen these at the Philadelphia Flower Show. They were giving these away too. So there's lots of places where you can get these, and we encourage you to get out and visit all of these gardens. You can see here, the one in your backyard, Ambler Arboretum, is right there, number 1, the advantages of having an A name. And you can get an idea of the map and where they're located. So I hope that we'll see you in the gardens, if only just to get your passport stamped. And of course, for lots more reasons. But for those of you who haven't been there in a while or have never been, the Arboretum started out as the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women back in 1911. So for more than 100 years, we have been a place for hands-on horticulture, learning, and experiences. And so it's really important to me as the director that people know that they can come in, they can visit, they can walk around, they can stop, they can touch the flowers, they can smell them, you know, they can really interact with the garden spaces and enjoy the time that they're there. And also, it's really important for me, for everybody to know that we are free and open to the public 7 days a week, 365 days a year, except in times of pandemics. Right now, we're closed. We're not open to the public for visitation, but when we are, we're open all the time and in all the seasons. And so winter is a beautiful time to come and visit the Arboretum because we're a university campus and because we are a school of horticulture. We have a lot of plants that are interesting in the seasons that you might not suspect plants would be interesting. So we have gardens that are dedicated to flowers that bloom from Halloween through Easter. And so we have flowers in the gardens 12 months out of the year. And so we really try hard to make it interesting in all of the seasons, and especially in those seasons where people maybe feel a little down because it's gray or you're kind of stuck inside. And we invite you to come and visit the gardens in all of those seasons. And so here you see our labyrinth, and this is part of our healing garden. Here we have our the formal perennial garden. This is in the spring, of course, and this is one of the oldest gardens dating back to the mid-1920s. Here's our this is our summer annual display with the visitor center. The women in the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women actually helped build this. This was a former head house for a greenhouse garden, or for a greenhouse complex, and they actually helped build that space. So always a place of hands-on learning. And here you see autumn in our Calabrero conifer garden. So our garden is not only a great place for exploring, for learning, for coming and just being out in nature, but it is a place of learning also. So if you're curious about what you can do in your landscape, if you have deer problem in your landscape, I'm sure some of you have deer problem in your landscape, you can come and visit the Arboretum. You can see what plants are tolerating the heavy deer pressure we have. You can come and see what looks great together in combinations and what is provides good fall color or multiple seasons of interest. And so it really is a learning place, and we hope that it'll be an inspiration and a model for all of you who garden as our neighbors. So we really want you to come and visit. Okay, so I'm the director, so I have to do this commercial for the Arboretum, right? And to let you know that we are membership, we've got volunteer opportunities, and we have events and community programs all throughout the year. And so we hope that you'll check us out and come and visit us. And we will get to the purpose of this talk, which is 4 seasons of vegetable gardening. And this picture that I have here, this is mostly pictures that I'm going to talk about various things that I think are important. And I geared this towards the beginning vegetable gardeners. And, but I'm happy to answer any questions, more advanced questions, that kind of thing. But I know, especially now when we're kind of at home and figuring out what we're going to do and keep ourselves busy or try new things, vegetable gardening is very popular in the garden centers and mail order catalogs, mail order companies, the seeds and sorry, I'm getting some feedback here. Seeds and transplants for vegetables are all sold out, right? So it's it is popular, and people are getting into the habit of gardening. So this picture here is a harvest from my backyard one summer, and we know it's summer because we see hot peppers and eggplants and tomatoes. And of course, this didn't come out of my garden. These are eggs. I have chickens too. I find chickens a nice complement to gardening and doing things in your backyard. They're not allowed everywhere, but happily I have them, and they bring me great joy. And right now, because I can't see my friends, I have approximately 11 dozen eggs in my refrigerator. This is becoming a problem. So I can only eat so much pudding and angel food cake and omelets. So here's a picture of my garden. So I live in the woods. And so when you're thinking about vegetable gardening, siting is very important, right? So there's a little sunny space, a little cutout in my woods. I'm not sure why, that I get mostly sun. And so I wouldn't say that I get full sun, because there's never a point in time that I garden in this space where I'm getting 8 hours of sun a day. And when you're thinking about growing food, and I really want to highlight that you can grow food and not have a vegetable garden. So you can incorporate edible plants into your landscape. You can, there's plenty of trees and shrubs that produce edible fruits that you can incorporate. You don't have to have just a vegetable garden to grow your own food, but you can grow vegetables in lots of places. So if your garden is mostly shady like mine is, but you have a deck or a back porch or something like that that gets full sun, you can grow vegetables in containers. There's no limit to where you can grow. You just have to know your conditions so that you can choose the right plants for your space. And so lessons that I've learned from gardening in my area where it is mostly shaded, and I get probably in the full, sorry, I have a landline and I can't stop it from ringing because I have a, believe it or not, a rotary phone. And so it just rings, but so, sorry if you heard that. So, so when you're selecting, you just need to know what your site conditions are. So you want to do a site analysis. You want to know how much sun you have. And if you want to grow the traditional vegetables, cucumbers, tomatoes, eggplants, that kind of thing that people, that are really popular and familiar to people, you're going to want full sun. And full sun means that it has 8 hours or more of sunlight during the day. Mine is somewhere around 6 usually. And so what I've learned in the process of experimenting in my own garden is that in my garden, I can't grow the giant tomatoes and the giant eggplants and the giant bell peppers. I can grow cherry tomatoes and hot peppers. The smaller vegetables seem to do fine in that amount of sunlight. But the other vegetables, the larger ones, need much fuller sun. And you can see here, so I have a small space. So each of these are 4 by 4. So I have 4 of those. And then I have these 3 by 4 beds back here, which were an addition because 4 by 4s I filled up very quickly. And so I just took this today and just wanted to show you there's weeds in here. These paths are wide enough to move a wheelbarrow around because I use compost in my gardens and I want to be able to dump the compost in there. The only area, oops, sorry. The only area of my yard that is fenced at all is the vegetable garden. I too have a significant deer pressure here. And so I have put in a 6-foot deer fence around my vegetable garden. So, and also I've tried to make the most use of my space by using vertical space. So I have trellises here. So this trellis I made, and I grow my cucumbers on this trellis. And this trellis, I grow my string beans on. And so I've been able to maximize space because I do have quite wide pathways here by growing up. And so I'm just going to tell you, these little green sprouts that you see back here, those are peas that I planted. Peas are cold weather crop, and so you can plant them. Usually the rule of thumb is you can plant them on St. Patrick's Day. And so on St. Patrick's Day, I planted these peas, and there's a zigzag of chicken wire in here so that the peas have something to grow up. Over here is my garlic patch, and my garlic patch, I planted those in October. Generally, rule of thumb is you want to plant your garlic by Halloween. You think of them like fall bulbs, like daffodils or crocus or something like that. You can plant them in the ground that time of the year, and then they're ready to harvest between June and July. When the leaves start turning a little yellow, then you can harvest them. And so it's about, I want to say 60 or 70 garlic plants, and you can harden them, you can harvest them, harden them off, and store them, so you don't have to eat them all at once, you know, because that would be a little intense for whoever that would keep people away, even if we were allowed to be together again. So, but you can store them. Also in here is my rhubarb. So we're going to talk a little bit about perennial vegetables. And so those are plants that come back every year, and you don't have to replant them, but you get to harvest them every year. So rhubarb is one of those. Generally considered a spring vegetable. You can harvest this pretty well into late spring into early summer. The red stalks, not the leaves, you don't eat the leaves, but the red stalks are edible. That's perennial, just keeps coming back year after year. And you can't see it in here, but this little dot here, that's an asparagus. This is also an asparagus patch. So this bed is dedicated to my perennial vegetables because you can't really till them or add much to them. So I want to keep them in one place. So that's my perennial vegetables. This corner here is my herb garden. Also, the perennials are coming up, but I add annuals in here. So this is lovage. And lovage is sort of like a celery that comes back year after year. And so I think I have a very hard time using all the celery they sell me in the grocery store. Just seems like a lot of celery. And so this lovage is a nice substitute because it tastes like celery, has a celery flavor. The stalks are sort of like celery in texture, but you only need to harvest one little stem or whatever you need for your recipe. although I do grow celery too, and find it much more easy and useful and practical to grow celery in the garden than to have to buy it and figure out what to do with all that celery. So also in here are garlic chives and oregano, thyme, those plants that come back year after year. I will also add in here basil and you know, other annuals, parsley, the things that I use a lot. So, and I planted cilantro in here. So when you're considering your space, of course, you want to spend time growing what you want to eat. You don't want to spend time growing things that you may never eat. When I was young, my parents had 2.5 acres of property, and a good quarter of that was a vegetable garden. And my mom finally gave up gardening when the potato beetles ate her last eggplant, and she didn't even like eggplant anyway. And my question always was, why are you growing it if you don't even like it? I can't remember us ever eating eggplant growing up, but she was growing it. But don't use your time and energy to grow things that you are not going to eat. It is very interesting to try and grow new foods and try and eat new foods and experiment with foods in new ways. But don't feel like you have to, especially if you have limited space or time to care for something. Grow what you love, or at least in the beginning. Grow what you really love, and then experiment from there. So I do have raised beds. You'll notice that I have raised beds here, and my raised beds I have because my soil is very poorly drained. I always said I should have built a kiln instead of a vegetable garden because there's so much clay in my soil. I can make little pots and little pieces of artwork from the soil. So what I've done is I created raised beds that I incorporate compost into that clayey soil to make better conditions for my plants to grow. So that is why I have raised beds here. In some cases, people garden in raised beds because there might be soil conditions other than drainage that might be an issue. I used to do vegetable gardening in Newark, New Jersey, and we did a lot of raised bed gardens there because there was issues with lead. So if you live in urban areas or around an old house that might have had lead paint on the outside of it, and you might be gardening near the edges, near the foundation of the house, you would want to consider raised beds because you don't want that lead in your plants that you're going to eat, especially. So so that's why I have raised beds. They're made out of white oak here. And then I do want to talk a little bit about crop rotation. So these trellises move around the garden, and that's because I rotate where I grow my plants each year. And we're going to talk a little bit about more how you rotate them, what you should consider a little bit later in this presentation. So my compost that I use, I make in my backyard. And so I do have a compost pile in my backyard made out of, it's a fancy compost pile made out of Trex because I got tired of replacing rotting pallets. I used to make them out of pallets. They would always rot. And so, so I went full on and did a Trex compost pile. So I compost in there all my vegetable scraps that the chickens don't eat. When I clean out the chicken coop, all that goes in the compost. And that's what I use for my, all the weeds I pull, everything I cut back from the garden goes in my compost pile. And so that's what I use. And every spring before I plant my garden, I top off my beds with compost, mix it in to the soil. And some of these look less full because they're perennial. And so I haven't added as much compost into those as I have into the ones that get planted every year. Back here in these corners, these are potatoes that have been planted. You can plant potatoes as soon as you start to work the soil, as soon as you can work the soil. And then over here, I've planted lettuce seeds. And so I have, I like a mixed green. So I plant lettuce, kale, beets, collards, and some mustards, and I just put all those seeds together so I have a nice little mix that I can harvest on a regular basis for salads. And so I don't add eggshells to my soil. I actually add eggshells to my chicken food, and so they get the calcium back in that they put out. So I don't do that. And so that's my garden outside, and yeah, so I try to get in there early, and I try to keep harvesting and extending the season as much as I can. So I'll plant peas again in August so I can get a fall crop of peas. And I'll keep planting radishes greens like spinach and all the lettuces and collards and things like that, I'll keep planting those every 2 weeks so that I can have this fresh rotation of crops and something fresh to eat from the garden. It's been great. We've already harvested asparagus and garlic chives from the garden, so already getting fresh stuff. So I've also been inspired by people during this time where you're less enthusiastic maybe about going to the grocery store. And so I've also, you know, to my point that you can grow a garden anywhere, these are the ends of lettuces that I've eaten. And so you just take the ends of the lettuce. These were actually hydroponically grown or aquaponically grown lettuce. So they still have the little cube here that supports them. And this one is just a head of, just the bottom of a head of lettuce where it's solid. There's root cells there, and you can activate them by kind of soaking them in water. These were chives that were cut down to here, or I'm sorry, not chives. They were scallions, green onions that were cut down to here. And I just put them in water, and now I have new scallions to eat that I've grown right on my counter underneath a window. And so they're just kind of sitting in water. I will have to put these in soil eventually. We can't not give them any nutrients and expect them to keep providing food. But here they are sprouting. And so, so you can grow vegetables anywhere, in a container, on a windowsill, in a garden. You can always have something fresh that you can harvest. And then there, of course, there's this other end of the spectrum, which is these enormous vegetable gardens, lots of space, very organized, not a weed to be found. Maybe professionals are taking care of this, but you know, so it runs the gamut, right, where you can garden. And so hopefully this information is helpful no matter what type of gardening you're trying to do. And so what I want to start off with is just the basics. If you're trying to vegetable garden and you haven't done it before, then some of this applies to any vegetable or any gardening in general, not just vegetable gardening, but knowing this information will help guide your decision making and your planning for your garden. And so some of the things you want to know is you want to know what zone you're in. So the United States is divided up into hardiness zones, and that's based on the average annual minimum temperature, right? So how cold it gets. And you can see that we're up here in southeastern PA, and we are somewhere between 7A and 7B in our hardiness zones. And so that's just helpful if you are trying to plant things like, for example, figs. I have 2 figs in my yard. They're not exactly hardy here. If you don't protect them, they die down to the ground, and each year they'll sprout up. The roots won't die. The branches will sprout up from the roots, but then you don't have enough time during the year to get fruits, to get figs. So you have to protect them because they are lower in the hardiness range. They really want to be living down here where it's warmer, and it's a little chilly up here for them. Same if you want to grow artichokes. That would be really hard to do because they have a really long growing season because they want to grow where it's really warm. So up here, you're not going to have as much luck with artichokes unless you have a greenhouse or something you can start them in. And so it's just something to keep in mind to know your hardiness zones and what you can actually grow and not grow here. And the information for that can be found either online or on the plant tag itself. It'll tell you what the hardiness zones are. So you want to be familiar with that. And then frost dates. Frost dates are really important, and when recommendations are being made for planting vegetables, it'll say, if you want to start from seed, it might say, sow indoors 8 weeks before last frost date, or plant direct sow, which means put it right in the soil outside after all danger of frost has passed. And so those instructions speak to knowing the last frost dates. Now, in our zones, zone 7A, 7B, typically it used to be that the recommendation was Mother's Day, that anything that was going to be killed by a frost, that is not hardy, that is not frost tolerant, not freeze tolerant, should be planted around Mother's Day and after that, because we don't get any frosts around Mother's Day, after Mother's Day. But in my experience with the warming of our climate, our change in zones, since I went to school 20-something years ago to be a horticulturist, the zone has actually, we've gone 1 zone higher, which means we've gotten 1 zone warmer. We used to be 6 in this area, and now we're 7. So now I make recommendations for May 1st. So I feel like you'd be comfortable planting out plants that are not freeze hardy after May 1st. We did just get freeze warnings and freezes this past week, just this week. I was in the 20s here and I lost an asparagus, which was devastating, but the chickens enjoyed it. It just froze and got all gross, but the chickens liked it anyway. So, so in April, you can still get freezes. So you want to know when those are. Not that you can't plant anything during if it's going to freeze, like my peas, they were up and they went through that freeze just fine. They're cold tolerant. That's why you can plant them in March. And so the rhubarb was up and did just fine in that cold. So, so some things are just fine and can tolerate that. Radishes would be just fine. There's plants that you can plant early. Cabbages, cole crops, cabbages, Brussels sprouts, collard greens, those kinds of things are pretty cold tolerant, so you can start those earlier. And then you also want to know the first frost in fall. And so you want to get a handle on that. Around here, it's usually November 1st, somewhere around there. And so if you think of your gardening season as May 1st to November 1st, that gives you an idea of those hardy plants that are those non-hardy plants that you can grow. So there's more tender plants like tomatoes, peppers, that kind of thing. Oh yeah, my onions, they're in already. They're sprouted already and they were fine in the cold. Onions are another good cold weather plant. And so, so you want to get an idea of that too, because there's not much more disappointing than growing all this beautiful food and then a frost comes and makes it all inedible. So you want to be aware of that and just know what you can, when you should be planting. But that'll help you with deciding when you read the instructions on the plants you want to grow. That'll help you with knowing when you can plant them. And it also helps with planning. So a lot of people get anxious in the winter. They want to do something that has to do with gardening and get their gardens ready. And so they might start sowing seeds in January or February. And if you count back from May 1st, 8 weeks, which is a general recommendation, 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost, you're only into the middle of March, right? From May 1st. And if you're starting your seeds in January or February, there's no way in the house, or it's very unlikely unless you have a lot of equipment to grow plants in your basement or in your house, that those plants are not going to be the healthiest plants. They're going to be stretched. They're going to be stressed. They're going to be kind of yellow because they're not getting enough sun. And so it really, you really do want to pay attention to that frost date and then count backwards. And it seems really late if you're just starting your seeds in mid-March, but it's perfect timing. If you do that, you're going to have more compact plants, more robust plants. They're not going to be water stressed, and you'll be able to plant them right outside into the garden. So that's why it's important to know that frost date. All right, and so what can you grow? So what can you harvest and what can you grow? So so these are plants. So these are things that you can find in the grocery stores at different times of year, sort of what's in season, but also what you can have growing cold in your garden. Now, I will say for us, January, February, and December, we're not growing anything in our gardens unless we have protected spaces or indoor gardens where you can still, on a windowsill during this time of the year, grow herbs, no problem. Greens, lettuces, and spinach, greens, especially if you like baby greens, they're all growable. But in the winter inside. But these plants, leeks, kale, cauliflower, cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, parsnips, turnips, rutabagas, they are all plant cabbages. You can plant all of these as seeds or transplants before that last frost. So let's say April 1st, you can start putting these between March 15th and April 1st, you can start putting those plants out. And also have those onion sets planted and those peas planted. So you can use that as a guide. And then in the spring here, you have your asparagus that will be coming up because it's perennial. I'll talk a little bit more about harvesting that and how to grow it. So this is sort of what you can find in a lot of markets and farm markets at that time of the year. So it can be inspiration for what you can grow and harvest that time of the year. So strawberries, Swiss chard, rhubarb, these are all things. Pineapples, you grow those inside from the pineapple top. You don't grow those in our garden around here. Okra is more of a summer plant here. So we don't want to forget fruit trees. You can do that too. So and you can see spring peas here. So these are the plants you can think about planting and explore and experiment with at these times of the year. But lettuce, leeks, again, all of those can be good spring crops. And then as you get into the summer, then you have your harvests of tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and hot peppers. Those have, and figs, if you keep your fig protected, and green beans. So those plants have a longer growing season and they're more tender than those other plants. So they don't like the cold. They're plants that need the soil temperature to be at least 50 degrees. And so you don't get that, the soil temperature, you don't get that until after that chance of frost has passed. You have more sun, the sun's higher in the sky, the days are warmer, so the soil's warmer. And so that's when you can plant out your squash, your corn, your peppers, your tomatoes, all of those. And so that is later in the spring, and then you can start harvesting them in the summer, and you can harvest them up until the frost, right? And you can even harvest them, in some cases like tomatoes, you can harvest them green and still enjoy them in some way. So cucumbers, that's another one. So these are your kind of summer crops. And then fall, you can go back to thinking about your cold weather plants, but it's hard because in fall, if you're going to grow cold weather plants in the fall, you have to plan and plant those in August, which seems counterintuitive because it's really normally hot, awfully hot in August, and you're thinking about cold weather crops. But remember, you're going kind of that 6 weeks. And so, so you want to get them in the ground so that you can have a harvest before everything freezes and it starts to snow. I love snow, so I hope for snow. I know I am often in the minority in that regard, but before everything freezes up and it starts to snow, you want to be able to have a harvest. You don't want to plant these in September, peas or radishes or something in September, and then just not get a harvest again. But if you plant them in August, you'll be able to get another row, you'll be able to get another harvest of peas, another harvest of greens, you might be able to get some onions, or at least young onions, scallions, green onions. So there's a lot of options out there for extending the seasons. So I encourage you to think about that in that way and look into your options and what you might be able to do. So the other thing that you have to do is in order to know what you can grow and how you're going to need to grow it is you should do a soil test, especially if you have those conditions, as I explained, where you might have lead as an issue, because lead is absorbed by plants, especially leafy greens like mustard and collards. And if you're planning to eat the food and you don't know what's happened in your soil, you should get a baseline. This only costs $9, this soil test. It is available at all the extension offices. There's Montgomery County has an extension office in Collegeville. There's in Bucks County and Doylestown. So you can get one of these for $9. I think they're mailing them out now. I think you can still order them and they'll mail them to you from online at this point because the offices are closed. But it's the best $9 you'll spend because basically you fill out this form, tell them what you want to grow, and they send you results back saying, okay, if you want to grow this, this is what you need to do to your soil. It tells you how much phosphorus and how much potassium is. It tells you the pH. Now you can buy kits at big box stores, soil testing kits that you just sort of add water and shake it up, and then you use a little chart to tell you what the color means. But what the problem with that is that is influenced by your water pH and whatever's going on in your water. So if you have hard water and high pH water, then that can not give you an accurate reading of what's going on in your soil. So it's really good to go through this testing process where they account for all of that. They use neutral water and everything, so that you can get a really accurate bit of information about your soil. And so that will help you and inform you about what you can do next. So if you have acidic soil, it'll tell you how to make it more basic. If you have too basic of soil, which is my trouble here, tell you how to make it more acidic. And basically, you put a bunch of soil in the mail, send it out, and a couple of weeks later, you'll get an email if you've checked that box, letting you know the soil test results, and you can get it in the mail also. If you wanted to test for heavy metals, things like lead and arsenic, it does cost an extra fee, and it's like $20 or something like that. But given, if you know some of the history about your place, it might be worth doing that. And I ran into a situation once at a community garden that had been an orchard before that. And way back, they used to use lead arsenate as an insecticide in orchards. And so we did test for lead and arsenic and had them both in the garden. And so had to figure out what to do with that information and how to amend that soil and work with the community gardeners. So, so it is something to consider. You want that baseline. So to take a soil sample, if you're not familiar with it, yeah, it is 4-H and Penn State Extension are the same offices. And so it is the Penn State Extension that you would go into, but if you're familiar with 4-H, that's the same office. So you go in. Sorry, I'm answering questions as I go, as I see them. So there's a couple of ways to do a soil sample. If you are just interested in what's going on for your vegetable garden, you're going to do a specific sample. So what you do is you take all these little stars are little samples that you're going to take with a trowel about 6 inches down. So not at the topsoil, but a little bit below the topsoil. You're going to take a scoopful from each of these spots, put it in a bucket, mix it all together and let it dry out. So this would be a specific sample. And you would tell them when you fill out the survey, I want to grow vegetables here. And then they would give you information. If you're trying to grow a better lawn, you might do a specific sample just in your lawn. If you were interested in just overall what's going on in your landscape, you could do a representative sample where you take some samples from here, from here, from here, from here, mix it all together, and then let it dry out, take a sample of that, put it in that plastic bag, drop it in the mail, and then await your results. So that's what a soil test does. And that is probably the most important thing you could do for your garden so that you know exactly what's going on. Most problems in gardens, landscape, ornamental gardens, or vegetable gardens result from the wrong plant in the wrong place or the wrong care of that plant. So basically not enough light, the wrong kind of soil, pH is wrong, creates stressed plants, which makes them susceptible to pests and diseases. So if you just fix the problem at the base, the root of the problem, you can prevent a lot of those other problems from happening. So, so you can, so that is that's why it's so important. So you want to do that. So once you find out what is going on with your soil, if there is an issue, I always tell people, I'm a firm believer in compost. Compost is the answer to almost any question in a garden. So, so compost is relatively neutral as it breaks down no matter what you put in it. As the microbes and the organisms break down the compost, you end up with material that is close to neutral. So whether you have acidic soil or basic soil, adding compost to it will help you get your soil where you want it to be. Also, in a situation like clayey soil, like I have at my house, I use compost as an amendment. A lot of people think, oh, I have clay soil, I'll add sand to it to loosen it up. Well, if you're familiar with how to make concrete, that is mixing sand and clay and water together. And so not advisable to add sand to your clayey soil. Instead, you want to add organic matter, and that's what compost is. That helps loosen it up, encourages the microorganisms and decomposers in there to loosen up the soil. And so that's what you want to do. You want to add compost to your soil. It's always good. You can compost at home. They have composters that you can keep inside your house if you don't have a space outside to compost. If you have space outside, at least part of it should be dedicated to composting. You can put your weeds in there. You can put vegetables and fruits. You don't feel so bad if you don't eat all of your vegetables and fruits before they go bad, because you can put them right in here and make new soil to grow new vegetables the following year. So composting, the process of composting is its own whole entire presentation, which is fun. But so just know that composting should be a part of your vegetable gardening process. It's great recycling. It keeps materials out of the waste stream and also gives you good soil. So that is definitely something to consider. So you take all of this and you get this nice material that you can grow in. It's a soil amendment, so you can grow in it, and it just works great. So it also, compost helps improve the moisture retention of your soil. It acts as a slow release fertilizer, so less nutrients are available over a longer period of time than conventional synthetic fertilizers. So it helps with your plants over the long run too. So so you can see that it would be really helpful. We do not use Upper Dublin Township compost at Temple, but we're not opposed to that. So you could see here just what they're throwing in. These are all high nitrogen materials here. So with composting, you do want to make sure you have a mix of what they call greens and browns. So anything that's sort of new and full of water is green. So all of this is considered greens here. These nutshells might be considered browns. The eggshells you can put in, they take a long time to decompose, so you want to crunch them up if you're going to compost them, break them up a little bit more. And then like the browns that go in my compost pile are leaves from the woods or wood chips from the chicken coop that are high in carbon and dry. And they serve two purposes. They help with the decomposition process, but they also act as sort of a neutralizer. And so they create a balance. If you just put all this wet stuff in your compost, you're going to end up with smelly compost. And that's what people are worried about a lot of times, why they don't compost, because they think it'll smell. If your compost smells, you're doing it wrong. And it usually means that your ratio of greens to browns is off. And so as long as you have those browns that you're adding in, this won't get smelly and it'll decompose and create really nice soil for you. So the next thing you want to decide is how you're going to manage your garden. And there's really three options as far as pest and weed control and watering, fertilizing, all of that. And that is, you have a choice of organic, integrated pest management, or conventional garden management. And so those are basically your options you can choose from. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each. And so organic means that you are not using any synthetic chemicals at all. The methods that you're using for controlling pests and diseases are created from natural products, naturally occurring products. You use beneficial insects, for example. So here's a ladybug that is a great thing to have in your garden because they eat all kinds of harmful insects that would bother your vegetable plants, like aphids and that kind of thing. So organic, you're welcoming lots of insects. You're actually planting plants to attract beneficial insects into your garden. You're doing a lot of hand picking of insects. There are chemicals that are labeled organic and safe for organic use. And so you're using those instead of alternatives that are not labeled for organic use. So that is, I call myself an organic gardener, and it's mostly I don't do much in the garden and I just hand pick things. That's what I do. I don't use any chemicals or fertilizers in my garden.
And it's
So
the director of the Ambler Arboretum at Temple.
So so that's one, that's organic. And then we have integrated pest management. So integrated pest management is a combination, it's a system of monitoring, evaluating, preventing, so doing right plant, right place like we talked about, and then taking an action. And that action uses the least toxic option first, and then moves up a scale of toxicity until you get to sort of synthetic chemicals as your option. But that is used only as a last resort when everything else isn't working. And so a lot of farms use this method of integrated pest management. So you really get to know your plants. You have to know exactly what they are, what they should look like. You have to be willing to sort of use traps and hand pick pests and weeds and things like that. You're learning a lot about the insects too. So you're learning when the insects will come out, and you're learning when to protect your plants. So for example, the squash vine borer, when you plant your zucchini squash out in the garden, there's a certain time of the year where the squash vine borer lays its eggs in the stem. And so if you just put a little row cover over that couple of weeks when that squash vine borer is out, you will prevent that squash vine borer from getting into your plants and will not have to use chemicals to get rid of it. And so that is what that is an organic practice too. It's also part of integrated pest management. So you're always in the garden, you're always monitoring. You've developed a threshold, what damage you're willing to accept, and then you're working to make sure you get as much food as you would like to get, but also working within this threshold. And so with prevention, you're using the right plant, right place, but also there's disease-resistant plant options that you can purchase that they don't tend to get powdery mildew. There's a mildew that's affecting basil. And so now there's a resistant strain of that basil that doesn't get that mildew. So you would just buy that resistant strain so that you don't have to worry about managing for pests in the first place. So that is an organic practice, and it's also an integrated pest management practice. So, and then your multiple tools, you always call it tools in a toolbox. You know, you have your hand picking, which is so you start off with mechanical controls, first prevention. And cultural control, so making sure it's the right plant for the right place, it has all the sun and water it needs, so it's as strong as plant as possible. And then with your actions, you have mechanical control, so that's hand pulling weeds, hand picking insects off, pruning dead out, that kind of thing. And then you move up to biological controls. Those are your ladybugs, those are some BT is an example, so that's Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a natural fungus that attacks caterpillars and of harmful insects, of harmful moths. And so you can use that. So that would be an example of a biological control, or using a pest natural enemy like aphids and having ladybugs eating aphids. So that's biological control. And then you would move up to chemical control. And in chemical control, you have organic chemicals that you could use, and then you move up to synthetic chemicals or more powerful chemicals as you go. So a lot of people never get to that synthetic chemical step, but that is what is IPM. And then monitoring is key. So you're out in the garden all the time, keeping up on what's going on, because it's much easier to stop an infestation at the beginning than when your plants are just decimated and there's holes everywhere and most of your leaves are missing. Then it's a little tough. So that's integrated pest management. And then you have conventional, and there's, you know, everybody has their idea of what they'd like to do and how they would like to garden. And these are all options that are available to you. At Temple, we use integrated pest management at the Ambler Arboretum. In my backyard, I'm organic gardener. They're different purposes, and they have different threshold levels and different ways they need to look and different expectations of production. And so we garden differently. The vegetable garden at Temple, I will say, is organic. So, so here, you know, typical Ortho, Bug Be Gone, Miracle Grow, plant food, these are synthetic chemicals. They're not rated for organic gardening. And, you know, they're part of a conventional garden management system. So when you are planting your garden, there's some choices you have to make. Do you want to go from seed and plant right in the garden? Do you want to start your plants from seed inside? Do you want to just have transplants that you plant out? And the backs of seed packets are full of information. So see, this is telling you when you should plant them, and that's based on our frost hardiness charts that we looked at before. This is green beans, and they give you a lot of information. They tell you when to sow, see average soil. They always say average soil. I just use whatever soil I have. Basically means not poorly drained, not high acid and not low acid, moderately drained soils. After danger of frost, right, in spring to early in summer. And so it gives you all of that information right there and how far apart to plant them. I usually fudge this because I don't have a lot of space to garden. So I usually plant mine closer together than what they recommend. And usually that's fine. So I do not have them 6 inches apart. I probably have them 3 inches apart because I don't have that big of a garden. And so far that's been fine. But you can start here with this recommendation and then see what to do from there. General rule of thumb is you plant your seeds about twice as deep as they are wide. So if it's a teeny tiny little seed, they don't need to go very deep at all. See, if you could put 5 plants in a 12-inch container, why do I have to put one every 6 inches? So that's my theory. So some options. Of course, you can direct sow this. So these are carrot seedlings. This is what you plant this is what it's called when you just put right in the ground. You dig a little trench with your finger or with your tool, and then you sprinkle seeds all along in here. So that's direct sowing your seeds. And that's what you would do with those green beans too. You just direct sow them. And you direct sow because the plant doesn't like to be transplanted. So it doesn't want to be grown in a pot and then moved. It just doesn't do very well, or doesn't grow well in a pot, and it grows much better in the soil. It'll grow just as fast. And it will take time to catch up if you grow it in a pot. So you can just direct sow these. So carrots, lettuces, things like that are great for direct sowing, and beans are good for direct sowing. Then there's plants that you want to have a head start on, so that as soon as it's warm enough, they're already starting to grow. Those are the longer season plants. So things like melons, cucumbers, zucchini, you can start those inside from seed. And then once the danger of frost is passed, so May 1st, you can put them outside and they already have a head start instead of planting them from seed. And then your other option, of course, are 6-packs or transplants. And transplants you can buy, these are tomatoes. You can buy them all sizes, 4-inch pots, bigger containers, these packs. It really depends on how much you need. I know in my small space, I only plant 3 tomatoes because that's all the space I have, and tomatoes get really big. And so I only plant a few. So I don't need to grow seeds of them. I don't need a pack of 100 seeds to grow 3 plants. So every year I just buy 3 tomato plants or 4 tomato plants. And I get my bigger tomatoes from the farm stand up the road, and then get my cherry tomatoes and plant those. So that can help you understand if you know how many you need or how much space you have, you can also make that decision. Also, if you don't have space to grow plants inside or the equipment to grow plants inside from seed, you can just buy these transplants. There's places around here that are really excellent about having early season crops and late season crops. So you can always find chard, greens, and that kind of thing, even early in the season at various like Ace Hardwares and Agway stores, places like that tend to have them. And planting, so here they are planted from transplant. And so basically it's the same as planting anything else. You want to look at the root mass and the soil mass that you have there, and you want to plant it about even with the top of the soil. You don't want to plant it deeper than that, with the exception of tomatoes. Tomatoes, you can actually plant up to its top set of leaves. And what will happen is tomatoes will form roots all the way along here, making a much stronger plant and more robust plant, and a little shorter, less leggy plant. So you might not want to plant it all the way to the top, but you can. But maybe you plant it up to here, and then roots will form all along here. So that's the one exception to that, if you wanted to do that. So, so watering is another issue in vegetable gardening. And so this is just overhead watering. Ideally, you want to water at the ground level. That's where the roots are. That's where the water needs to get. Generally, you don't want to water over the top like this. That can cause disease. And if we talk about preventing pests and limiting the amount of work we have to do in our garden, this watering overhead, it can be a big problem causer. So I know rain in nature, it rains and that's overhead, but we seem to not be able to do as good a job as Mother Nature does at this. So watering at the base, at the soil, is where you want to be. That also saves water, because a lot of water that ends up on leaves evaporates off. You also want to water, when you want to water in the morning. If you can water in the first thing in the morning before you head off to work or before you start your day, you can water in the morning. And what that does is give plants a chance to dry out and water a chance to get down to the roots. You don't want to water in the middle of the day because evaporation happens much quicker then. And you don't want to water at night because it gets cooler and it stays wet. And that is prime situation for diseases to form and to start, and for fungus and bacteria to start. So you don't want that to happen. You don't want mold and that kind of thing in these cold, damp, overnight situations. So in the morning is the best time to water. And you want to water regularly. Vegetables need a lot of water, especially in raised beds. They need even more water because they're kind of raised up and warm up faster. So you want to water well and regularly, but you don't need to water every day a sprinkle. You want to water deeply and more infrequently than every day just going out and giving a sprinkle. That helps form much deeper roots, and it helps the plants be much less susceptible to drought than if you just go out and sprinkle overhead every day for a couple of minutes, and instead spend a good half hour out there watering at the soil level every third day or every other day. When they're seedlings and don't have a lot of roots, they need more water. As they establish better root systems, they shouldn't need as much water. In containers, you need to water more regularly. And so here is a weed. This is not my garden. I feel like I need to say that, but not that my garden has never looked like this, because it has. So here you can see the desirable plants are the vegetables up here, right? These are, looks like collard greens or broccoli or some sort of cold crop up here. Maybe even little, I don't know. So this is your vegetable, your desirable plant here. And then these are all weeds. Now, some of these weeds, like this one here, are edible, but probably not the desired plant that you want. So you want to make sure that you are controlling weeds. Weeds are easier to get when they're little. They're more annoying to get, but they're easier to pull out because the roots aren't so established and you don't lose as much soil. So you want to get weeds as soon as they start. You can mulch in your garden. You can use straw or leaves, shredded up leaves as mulch in your garden. That's fine. It helps keeps weeds down just like it does in your landscape. So you do, because they compete for your water and the nutrients from the vegetables that you're trying to grow, you want to make sure you keep them out there. They also compete for sunlight. So you want to make sure that they're weeded. And you can do that by hand. That's mostly what you would be doing. You can also use tools, mechanical, like a stirrup hose are great, and hand pulling works really well too. And then you can compost those weeds when you're finished pulling them out. And so I did talk about crop rotation. And so each year you want to rotate your crops. You don't want to grow the same plant in the same place you've always been growing it, for a few reasons. One is those plants get pests and diseases. And if you move them around, they're less likely to get those pests and diseases. They might have introduced a pest or disease in the area. And if you move it, then that plant won't get it again, or is less likely to get it again. And they also use different nutrients and replace different nutrients in the soil. So if you can move them around, you have a much better chance of getting a better harvest. And so here you see, this is what I go by. This is kind of easy to remember. There's lots of different rememberings out there, but this is thinking about the part that you eat. So like say I have my 4x4 gardens. One year this bed will be a root crop. So my potatoes are in here. The next year I will plant my leaf crop in here. The next year I will plant my beans in here. And then the next year I might plant my tomatoes in here. So you just keep rotating those around, thinking about it that way. And that really helps the soil, and it helps the plants, and it helps with lessening disease and insect pressure in there. All right, so that is crop rotation. And then I just did want to talk just about perennial vegetables. And, you can grow different edible shrubs, trees that produce edible fruits. And perennial vegetables are great because you only have to plant them once, come back year, and they come back year after year. With asparagus, it's kind of disappointing at first because when you plant it, you get this ball of roots and you plant them and you cannot harvest it for 2 years. Because asparagus here, this is a flower bud and this is the stem, right? And so that's what you eat. So if you cut this off in its first year, basically it has no chance to make energy or put in any food for next year's growth of the plant. So you want to give it 2 years so it can develop this big root mass so it can send up these stalks, and then you can harvest them and eat them. So you have to be patient. And they look really cool and they look delicious, but you have to be patient. So it's 2 years. Rhubarb is another perennial vegetable that you can grow. Horseradish is another one that you can grow. That one goes a little crazy. You want to plant that in some place that's contained. It can spread. So this is another one. So the leaves are toxic, which means that the deer don't eat them, which is nice. But and you could maybe work this into an ornamental garden someplace. But it's the red stalks that you eat. So you just cut off these leaves and you cut off this stalk, and that's what you harvest and eat. This comes back year after year and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And you add enough sugar and strawberries and a pie crust, it tastes delicious. So trying to think some other perennial vegetables, but yeah, horseradish, rhubarb, asparagus, those are all good ones. And then of course there's herbs. So you have perennial herbs that you can plant that come back year after year. An herb garden is great. They tend to be pest resistant. A lot of insects and diseases do not bother herbs at all, and they're edible. I mean, here's chives. Look how beautiful this is. Comes back every year. You can eat the flowers and you can eat the leaves as chives. So so those are plants you can think of too that you can add into your garden that will help with your cooking and let you experiment some more and add something different to your garden. And so with that, with the perennial vegetables and thinking about plants that come back year after year, and also this, you could easily incorporate this into an ornamental garden, but then you can still eat it. So I want you to think differently about the seasons, about where you can plant vegetables, how you can grow them, and that you don't need this, very particular garden space that's designated as vegetable garden in order to grow food. And so with that, I would like to answer questions. I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to answer any questions that we have. Does that sound good?
All right, Kathy, you actually answered a lot of the ones that were asked in the chat, but I do have a couple just to follow up. There was one asking specifically, do you need a liner for a raised garden bed?
Oh, so I'm going to, let's see what I'm going to do here. So no, you don't need a liner for a raised garden bed. In some cases, you might want to use a liner. So for example, if, I'm going to put my video on. So for example, if you had a lead in your soil or something like that, you might want to use a liner, but you would need a deeper bed. Yes, Jerusalem artichoke is another perennial vegetable. So, but then you need deeper beds because you need drainage. If you have a bed just like mine is only a foot deep, but it goes down into the ground, so the roots can go as deep as they need to. So so it doesn't need to be a deep bed, but if you wanted to use a liner because you had something like lead or something like that going on, you would need a good 2-foot bed at least, so that there's enough soil mass and drainage that can support the roots. Tomato roots can go 3 feet deep. So if you think about that, you need all that space for the roots. People always think carrots are the deepest roots, but it's tomatoes go pretty far. So you don't need to put a liner in it. You don't have to.
And the other question to follow up on the liner is, what kind of liner do you use?
So what I've used in the past is, one is the depth of the soil can be enough. So the only way that heavy metals travel up is through roots and getting absorbed into plants. It doesn't move up in soil. It'll just stay where it is. So if you have enough of a soil mass that the roots won't go down into it, you could just use a deep amount of soil. And then we've used landscape fabric because you don't want to create a pond. You just want to create that barrier so the soil doesn't mix. And so you can use landscape fabric for that.
Okay. Someone else asked, where do you get your compost?
So my own compost I make in my yard, and that's the only compost that I use. When I first moved here, and I hadn't had a compost pile yet, I went to a local farm and they had composted manure available. And so I used that. And then the next year I just had my own compost. So I make enough compost in my compost pile to top off my beds every year. So I started off with compost from a farm and then went from there. Municipalities do offer compost a lot of times from their leaf collection and debris collection programs. So you can look into that too.
Okay. The statement that when you made about the eggshells, someone had asked about that. They didn't hear what you said about using eggshells in the gardens.
So I don't put eggshells in the gardens. I have seen people do that, but they don't decompose quickly. So some people will put eggshells in their compost pile and crunch them up. What I said I do is I actually use a mortar and pestle and grind up my eggshells and feed them back to the chickens, which sounds weird, but it replaces the calcium there. So that's where I use mine. You can put it in there. I've seen people try to compost in place, just sort of throwing their scraps into the ground and burying it. I wouldn't recommend that. That doesn't decompose as quickly, and you don't make as good soil and as much of an impact as if you just have a pile and compost it. And certainly eggs are fine in there. I just don't use them in there.
Okay. Someone did comment about how wonderful we've had several comments on how wonderful the presentation was, and they were asking if they could see this information again. We did make a recording of this, and it will be posted over the weekend on our website, as well as through our social media. There will be links available. Our website is www.upperdublinrec.net, and it is in the chat box as well. And we will give that information again at the end of the presentation.
Perfect.
We have another question. Someone said that you showed in one of the slides, I'm sorry, let's see, trying to get to. You mentioned an edible weed in the midst of the weedy bed. Can you
Yes.
show it again and identify it, please?
I can try. Let's see. It was this one. And let me see if I can. So it was this one, and here you go. So it was this. This one was edible, and the name has just escaped me. I can get it to you.
Okay.
But I can't I remember it's edible, but I can't remember the name of it right now. I'm sorry.
All right.
Ay, ay, ay.
Is my 3 cubic yards compost pile is 90% brown leaves. I put I put vegetable scraps in, but it's no match to the brown stuff. I do use red worms, but basically I have to wait for about a year for it to decompose. Moreover, the pile does not heat up. Suggestions?
Yes. So a couple of things. One is there has to be a balance, or you won't make compost, or it'll be very slow to compost. So what I've seen people do is they create a little area that's fenced off next to the compost pile, and that's where they store the browns, because at certain times of the year, like in the summer, when you're just throwing tons of vegetable scraps and tons of weeds in there, it's lots of greens, and a lot of times at that time of the year you don't have browns, and so you need the storage of browns. And so some people take their leaves and they store them in a little side pile, and then in the summer they have browns that they can add. So that might be something to consider. The other thing to do to heat up your compost pile, because it's only 3 cubic yards, you want to turn it frequently. That helps activate the organisms in there, get new stuff into the interior of the pile, and those the macro and microorganisms that are breaking it down help generate the heat. And so turning it more frequently helps heat up the pile and helps accelerate the decomposition process.
All right. Other than the fence, what do you suggest as the best way to keep deer away?
Well, you can, oh, I mean, there's options, but so probably the next best option is spraying. But if you're going to eat the food, spraying things that smell like putrescent eggs and garlic and hot peppers might not make it so desirable to eat or even want to be out in there. So there are some people who use motion activated sprinklers, and you know, so there's options out there. Alternating, not having a regular routine with your dog, if you have a dog, is a good way to keep deer away, instead of because deer learn, and they can learn when you bring your dog out. So if you alternate that and kind of mix it up a little bit, that's a good way to keep them out of there. But yeah, I guess sprays would be the next best option. There are, yeah, instead of 6-foot fence, if you don't want to do that, you can also do an electric fence, which has fewer, you know, it's not as obtrusive, and you can keep them away that way. There's portable ones you can get at like Tractor Supply and that kind of thing.
Okay. We planted a fig tree about 10 or so years ago. It grows beautifully and makes tons of tiny figs that never mature. Any idea what we can do?
Yeah, so that is part, that's part of the function, or probably part of the problem of this plant being from warmer areas. It does need a longer growing season. It's that happens quite frequently, and so well, I don't know how you protect your tree, and if if it grows from the ground up every year, or if you do protect it, you know, higher up. I cover mine in leaves, all kinds of leaves, feet up, and so I'm able to get figs, but they don't ripen until October usually. So what I would say is definitely protect it a lot, and then it could be that it needs more sun or needs to be warmer. I will say in the last few years, it's been so rainy and cold and cloudy during the summers that it's been terrible, and nobody's probably gotten figs over the last couple of years.
All right, another question. Would grass clippings or coffee grounds heat up their leaf pile?
Yep, both of those would help. They would add greens to there for sure. Yep.
Two common edible weeds, lamb's quarter and purslane.
Lamb's quarter, that was it. And there is purslane, yes, yes.
We're both in that picture.
Yes, yep. Lamb's quarter was the silvery gray leaves. That was it. Thank you very much, Mary.
And then I have a good source for fresh horse manure. How best to use in composting? Use the overabundance of brown leaves.
Yes, so so you can mix that in. You want it to be composted. So, and you want that to sit for at least a year. So you want it to be composted. I mean, if your leaves are sitting for a year, you know, it might all work out, but you definitely want to make sure that your horse manure is composted before you use it in your garden. And a lot of that is because there's a lot of weed seeds in horse manure. And so you don't want to start spreading that around all over the place. So, I would incorporate it in, but you still want to have that ratio of browns to greens, and that you could consider a green, that horse manure, and just sort of, that would definitely help with the leaves though.
Okay. That's all we have in the chat box. Does anybody have any additional questions? All right. Well, I would like to thank Kathy for this wonderful presentation. So much information. Oh, wait, we have raised hands. Hold on. No, they're claps. They're not raised. People clapping. Love that. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that I will see all of you in the Arboretum at some point. You see my face now, so stop and say hi. If you see me in the gardens, I try to walk around there quite a bit.
Look at all the clapping that you have.
Yay. Love it. Thumbs up and clapping. That's great. Thank you.
We have many other opportunities over the next couple days to continue with our celebration of Earth Day. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and our website for updates and details. And we will continue all of these different events over the upcoming weeks. We have a lot more things. We did have a lot of questions and requests in the chat box for some upcoming programs. And Kathy, you are one of the most requested people I've ever heard. So we will be chatting with her, and we will see what other offerings we can come up with. But at this time, thank you all. And we look forward to seeing you in the very near future.